All right, we are so excited today to have Tom Corson-Knowles with us. He is the owner of TCK Publishing, as well as the Publisher Profits podcast. And we are so excited to be able to ask him our questions and get them answered. So Tom, thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Keri. It's great to be here.
So tell me, I know you've written 27 books and you've co-written one. So tell me, how did you get started as an author? Because that's a lot of books for someone that, not to be ageist because I myself am young, but someone that's fairly young.
Yeah. So I started writing when I was probably 11 or 12 years old. I just opened up an old style Word document on a computer and started writing poetry. But I didn't really think anything of it because I didn't know anyone who wrote poetry or wrote anything. And I never even considered it being a career. And that was until I went to business school. And I realized really quickly I did not want to go to Wall Street and become an investment banker like a lot of my co-students wanted to become. And so I was kind of freaking out about my future and my career and what I wanted to do with my life. And so I guess instinctually, again, opened up a Word document and started writing out what I wanted with my life. And that turned out to become a personal manifesto, and that turned out to become my first book. So that's how I got started.
That is amazing. And I mean, I think it's amazing that not only did you start writing, but you went somewhere with it. I feel like so many people will write a book in their lifetime and then like, okay, I did it, I'm done. And you not only took it for your own writing, but then you created your own publishing house, which is crazy. And what I love about your publishing house is that it's not a vanity press. It's a true small press where you work together with authors. You offer so many free services. It's crazy. And then you split profits with them. So when did that you went from the document on your computer to writing your own book? How did you then move into publishing?
Yeah, so I did what I think a lot of authors do is I tried to follow the traditional route, find a literary agent and then have them sell your book to a publisher. And this was kind of the early days of the internet. So there were a few websites that kind of told you, here's what to do to become a published author. And I followed what they said exactly. I mean, I wrote the query letters. I sent all these submissions in the mail. Most people didn't even take email submissions back then. It was all still in the mail. And I just remember sending out all these different submissions, year after year after year, and just nothing. I wasn't even getting rejection letters. I would try calling people. I wouldn't even get responses. And then I tried emailing people, no responses. So, I just felt like so just abandoned by the industry. I just couldn't imagine that industry could treat someone who wanted to get involved and had a promising work, or just completely ignore them. I just didn't really think that would happen. So I kind of was disheartened. I gave up for a couple of years. And then I heard about self-publishing on Amazon. And that's when the light bulb kind of clicked for me. And I said, hey, if I can, start my own blog, it can't be that much more difficult to just take my book and publish it on Amazon. So I figured out how to do that with an ebook and started selling really well. In the first 12 months, I had my first $12,000+ month in royalties from my ebooks. And then after that, I was like, hey, this is amazing. I don't need to, search for another job or another career now. I can just become an author. And so what's next for me? And what's next for me is I wanted to teach other people how to do the same thing because I was just so excited about it. I was so happy. I was so fulfilled that I had my dream fulfilled. I want to help share that with other people. And so that's when I started sharing more on social media and started blogging about what I was doing. And a few authors reached out and said, hey, can you publish my books for me? And so that's kind of how the process started.
Excuse me. So I love that. And I love that you have then shared it. And that shows in your publishing company now, the way that you treat your authors. You really treat them like partners. It's not, okay, I'll give you this small little upfront check and then you can have 5%, 6%. I mean, the way that you treat your authors totally jives with what you just said, and the fact that you are partnering with people, you're helping them learn, you're helping them actually promote their books, which is amazing. In this industry, I think especially, there's a lot of people out there who feel that when they publish, even with big traditional houses, when they publish, they feel like they're publishing almost on their own. The publisher gets the book out and they're like, okay, go make your website, go do your promotion, and it better sell or you don't get another book. And so I love that you really partner with your authors, which is amazing. And so I know that you went from publishing and you have some really big bestsellers there. You've got Unlimited Memory from Kevin, which is huge. And you've kind of built on that. So how did you then go from, you just kept evolving. You went from author to publisher, and now you're podcasting. So how did that come about?
So yeah, so I've just always been kind of asking this question in the back of my mind, like, how can I help more authors? How can I help more people? You know, how can I make a difference? And so for me, the reason I got involved in books and writing is because I love reading books. I read books like my whole life. And so it's my passion to learn, right? And so for me, you know, I don't consider myself just an author or just an entrepreneur, right? Like, I feel like I'm so much more than that. And for me, it's kind of like the big picture thing that all of my life is kind of wrapped under is just this love for learning. So whether it comes to, you know, speaking on an interview like this, or speaking at a public event, or doing a podcast, or writing a blog post, or publishing a book, for me, it's all about how can I share a message? How can I share some information that's really going to make a difference in someone's life, right? And so that's what I've really been focused on it. And I like doing the podcast because I was able to then interview, you know, best-selling authors and literary agents and accountants and attorneys and all the different people in the industry to figure out what really happens, what things are really like, and what information do authors really need to know to help take their career to the next level. So that was really the impetus for me to start the podcast.
That's awesome. And it is amazing how every author comes with their own set of like unique experience. I just found out one of my fiction authors was a professor at one point, which I never would have pegged him for. And he's like, oh yeah, back in college in the 1960s. I was like, oh yeah, of course. So it's amazing how that works. And so with your podcast, did you start from the ground up? Do you run it by yourself? Do you have a team? I know we've got a lot of authors who want to get on a podcast or start a podcast. So what kind of startup did you have?
Yeah, so I've had several podcasts over the years. So when I first started, there was an old website called Podomatic, which I think still exists, but you could basically upload your first podcast for free on there. So now it's a little more advanced what we do. But basically, all you have to do is you can use free software like Zoom, just like this, to record an interview or record yourself just talking in front of the camera. Or you can even share your screen and use PowerPoint slides if you want to do something like that, for like a YouTube video. So you basically just have to record the content, right? And then the next step is to how do you edit the content, right? And so there's free software. I can't think of the name right now, but if you do Google how to start a podcast, there's this great blog, and it's like number one in Google, how to start a podcast. And the guy shares everything on podcasting. He's amazing. I interviewed him for my show one time. So all the information is out there about what to do in terms of how to edit it. So you can edit it yourself, or you can hire a company to edit it for you. And basically, when you're editing a podcast, you just want to make sure, like, you know, if there's a long space, if like someone calls in the middle of an interview and there's like a break, you know, you remove that part. So just make sure, you know, it sounds good. Remove any ums or ahs if you really want to do that, but that's not necessary. And just make sure you have like a good clean file. And then there's some other audio things you can do to, like, you know, balance out the sound levels and all that, but it's not that complicated if you want to do it yourself and learn by Googling it, or just hire a company to do it. And so at this point, we hire a company to edit the podcast for us. And then once you have the edited file, all you have to do is just upload it and put it on your blog. And again, if you just go how to start a podcast, the guy, his name is Daniel. I can't remember his last name right now, but he's amazing. He'll teach you every single step of how to start your own podcast. But actually, my girlfriend just started a podcast with two of her friends a couple of weeks ago, and they're already up and running. And they didn't even ask me for help; they just figured it out on their own. So it's not that complicated. If it's one of those things that you really want to do, again, just Google it and set aside a couple hours to try to figure it out and learn to do it yourself. And if you're ever not sure, you know, email me, ask a question, or email someone else who knows, or join a Facebook group for podcasting and ask people. Like, there's so many people on the internet who will help you figure out whatever it is you want to create or do.
Yeah. And to your point, podcasting has come a long way. There's so much more information out there now than there used to be, which is great. And it's fairly easy access to get your podcast up on places where people can find it. I know we use in-house a software called Camtasia for editing, which is really great and easy to use. So that's an option. And then certainly you can pay people to just do it for you, which is great. Now with podcasting, do you I mean, obviously you invite people to be a guest on your show, but how often do you invite people opposed to people pitching themselves to you and then they end up on your podcast?
Yeah, good question. So we actually haven't done, just to explain, we haven't done any new shows in a couple of years. So we were doing it like every week for several years, and we kind of stopped recently. But what we were doing is we would have our own list in-house. So like, who do we want to be on the show? Who do we want to invite to the show? And then of course, every once in a while we would get emails. We get several pitches a week from people who would say, hey, I want to be on your show. And we would go through and see if they were a good fit. But kind of my process was always, I wanted to make sure, first of all, it's someone that I'm excited to talk about. Because if I'm going to be bored in the interview, it's not going to be fun for me. Like, I don't want to do that. Like, I want to spend my time talking with people that, like, you know, I want to learn from them. There's a lot of things I want to ask them, and I know that they're going to add value to my audience. So for me, it was always kind of like looking at their website, figuring out what they've done with their life, maybe looking at some of their interviews they've done on other podcasts or on YouTube, so I can get a sense for, you know, who this person is, what they're like, and if there's someone I really want to interview. And if I looked at their information, I thought, hey, I can't wait to talk to this person, then I would send them the email and invite them to the show.
That's good. Did you get a lot of rejections or people who just didn't respond to you, or were most people overall responsive?
Yeah, I mean, it's like anything. I've done a lot of outreach via email and social media over the years, just trying to reach out to people and say, hey, I'd like to interview you for my show, or I'd like to write a blog post for your website, or vice versa. And in my experience, usually about 1 out of 10 or 2 out of 10 people will respond and say, yes, let's do it. And the rest will either ignore you or say it's not the right time, or for whatever reason. So I think it's a good rule of thumb is, you know, if you want 20 people on your podcast, you're gonna have to email, you know, 10 times or 5 times that many people to get that number of people to actually show up.
That's really good advice, that if you only plan for the people, like if you say I emailed 10 people, I've got 10 weeks of podcasts, that's probably not the case. Certainly for timing as well. Sometimes people just aren't available. So on the flip side, when people were pitching themselves to you and asking to be on your podcast, were there anything that they did that really stood out as positive or negative?
Yeah, so one of my kind of pet peeves with email is like you send me this giant email, especially if it's just like one block of text, because it's like, you know, 80 sentences in one paragraph is just too hard to read. It takes a long time. And so I love the short emails. I would say, hey, like just direct to the point, like, hey, I'm such and such person. I founded this website, or I'm author of this book, and I want to be a guest on your podcast. And maybe they send me some more information about what they do, what they want to talk about on the show, but really briefly. And maybe they have an attachment for like a press kit or something like that. Or sometimes they would have like a link to their website, and like that page on the website would talk more about what they have to offer and the types of questions they can answer and the types of topics they're an expert on. So I like the quick emails, short to the point. Let me know what they wanted, what their request was. That's another pet peeve of mine with email is I get this long email and I've read the whole thing and I don't even know what this person wants. So I don't even know how to respond. Like, what do I say? I have to respond and say, hey, can you tell me what you want? Because I can't figure it out from reading your email. So that's what I love, is the clear emails that were short and concise, and let me know like what they're an expert on, what they want to talk about, so that I could get a quick understanding of if they're going to be, if they might be a good fit or not. And if I think they might be, then I can go look at their website, look at their interviews, and see if it's someone I really want to connect with.
Yeah, I found definitely being brief is really important, and put your ask right up in the front, because no one likes to feel kind of buttered up before you say something. Just put it right on out there and ask. I know that's how I got Tom on the show. I was like, okay, Tom, got a question. And so it tends to work way better that way. So for sure. And when people are prepping to come on your show, is there any big like faux pas of people who come on the show and then they just ruin it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. So one is just having a really good internet connection. It's super important, and it's not always like you can't always predict ahead of time there's going to be a storm or something. But if you've done Zoom calls before and you're constantly lagging, or it's not working well, or you don't have good audio, those kinds of things can really ruin a podcast, because you need good audio quality and good connection quality to record something that people are actually going to spend an hour or so to listen to when they're working out or at home or in the car or whatnot. So that's the biggest thing, is making sure that you understand how the technology works, you have a good microphone, you have a good audio setup and video setup. That's a big thing. And then other than that, it's just making sure that you're, present. I recommend people like meditate before, like, spend like 5 minutes doing a breathing exercise or meditation before you go into a big meeting or a big presentation, because just taking that time to take a step back and to get centered in your body will help you be more calm, be less anxious, be less nervous, and actually listen to the other person and have like a real good discussion, so that it doesn't feel like, two people talking, but they're not really on the same level. You know what I mean?
Right. We've certainly seen that people talking at each other rather than with each other, which I think is important also because authors they have a point in being on a podcast. They want to talk about their book, but they really have to be open to be led by the podcaster, because the podcaster knows their audience, right? Like, what people want to hear about. So if I just come in with my own agenda and I'm just interrupting you constantly to get there, I can see where that would be a huge problem. And you mentioned microphones. Do you have any favorites?
So I use the Blue Yeti. That's what I'm using right now. I like that one because it's cheap and it works well. It's easy to use. I've been using it for, gosh, it must be almost 10 years now. So it's nice. There's lots of other great ones out there. I like this one because it's less than $100 and it works really well. But you can, Google your favorite microphones or best microphones, and you can find a lot of good stuff out there. But for me, I generally try to avoid the really expensive. I once bought like a $600 lavalier mic. You have it like pins to your shirt and all that, and it was just so complicated. And I just didn't really think it was nearly as user friendly, and it just took a lot of time to set up. And I like this because you just plug it into your USB on your computer and you're good to go.
I couldn't agree more. I have a Blue Snowball myself, and I think having it just easy setup, because what you don't want to do is get caught up in wires or something while you're podcasting with somebody. And also, generally, I think try to avoid the giant earphones that wrap around your face like a little space machine there. So good advice. And so when people are working with you on podcasting, what do you find makes a really great interview? Is it strictly sticking to topics? Is it being open to talking about their own personal experiences? Like, what makes a really stiff interview opposed to one that you're like, okay, we can keep going?
So, you're talking about from the perspective of the person who's being interviewed? It's like the author wants to get an interview?
Yes, if they want to get in an interview and they are really trying to make sure that it's a good interview, like what makes a good or a bad?
Yeah, so I think a big part of it is just being comfortable in your own skin and like you said, not coming in with a big agenda. Like for this call, like I didn't know we were going to talk about podcasting. I had no idea kind of what the agenda was going to be, but I'm totally cool with just flowing with whatever you ask, because for me, it's like a conversation, right? And my goal is how can I add as much value as possible to the people who are listening. And so I think what makes a bad interview is when you're so focused on what you want. I want to sell my books. I want to sell XYZ. When you're so focused on that, it comes across because you're not answering the questions in a way that's designed to add value to your listeners. And so I'm always trying to, when we're having this discussion, I know you and I are just talking, right? But it's not for me and it's not for you, it's for the listener. So I'm trying to figure out, what can I say? How can I add value? Who is that person who might be listening to the show, and what do they need to know about this to make sure they understand it, right? So, you and I could talk about publishing industry lingo all day and use, all these buzzwords and language that most people don't understand, but that wouldn't be helpful for someone who's brand new to the industry, right? And so I always try to make things as simple as possible so that even someone who's never heard about this topic ever before can kind of understand and follow along. So that's what I recommend, is just always be focused on who is your listener and try to picture them in your mind. And every time you're talking, every question you get, just ask yourself, how can I add value to that person? How can I explain this better for that person? And if that's your whole focus, is just to explain things in a way that your listener understands and gets it, then it can't possibly be a bad interview. Because I think what happens when there's a bad interview is people don't understand, right? They don't get it, they get lost, or the speaker rambles a lot and the person listening feels like they're not really connected to that discussion, right? So as long as that's your focus and you practice a lot, I think you'll do really well. Just realize that, they're your first interview and your first YouTube video and your first public speech is not going to be that good, because no one's first is that good, right? So my question is, can you do 100? all right? Because I want to see you after you've done your 101st one, right? Because then you'll be comfortable, you'll have experience, and you'll do a lot better. So there's this great saying that, anything worth doing is worth doing poorly at first. And so don't be afraid to go in and mess up and make mistakes. And, that's okay. That's how you learn. And just be patient with yourself as you go through that learning process, and you will get better.
Yeah, and I love that you spoke to hitting your audience where they are at, because so many people take the time. They're like, I got this podcast. It's my time to prove myself. Let me show them my vocabulary, or, let's pull it all out. If you have to go look through a thesaurus before your interview, then that's probably a bad idea. Everyone's tempted. You want to seem intelligent, but I think it's important what you said is meeting people where they're at and making sure that you research. I have seen, and I'm sure Tom will agree, one of the worst things that you can do is not research the podcast you're going on and having no clue who you're talking to. So on that point, what do you suggest that authors or people being interviewed do to prep for their podcast as far as research on the other person?
Yeah, great question. So it depends what your relationship is with that person, right? So if you already know them somewhat, you can do a little bit less research. If there's someone you just did some outreach to, they're a totally new person, then definitely take a look at their website. I would take a look at their social media, seeing what they're posting, try to get a little more feel for their personality, what their interests are right now in life, and then definitely listen to some of their interviews, listen to their podcast, listen to their show, because that's going to tell you so much about the format and how it works, the types of questions that they like to ask. Some interviewers, for example, will always ask the same 5 questions, and maybe there'll be different questions in the middle, and some will just be the same question every single time. And so I love where it's more kind of a freestyle, where it's there's some there's some structure to it, where there's a few questions that are the same every time, but there's a lot of different ones in the middle. But you'll learn that by actually listening to their podcast and trying to figure out who that person is. So what I like to do is I like to look at their podcast and I go through them and then look for a title of one that ooh, I want to learn about that. And so for me, it's while I'm doing research, I'm also learning something I'm interested in. And so that for me works really, really well.
That's good. And also that way you can know if there's anything in advance that you don't want to talk about. If a podcaster regularly talks about politics and you're like, I'm not ready to go there, you can let them know in advance. I think that's another thing that people really need to know, is that it's okay to set boundaries around certain things if you're not open to talk to them about it, but you need to do it early, not in the middle of the interview. Go, well, I'm not going to talk about that, because that makes it's like, oh, okay, well, my next question, let's go 3 down and try to find it. So I think it's important that you do have a feel for that podcast and make sure it's a good fit too, because just because you get a slot or get invited on a podcast doesn't mean that you will shine in that arena. If someone asked me right now to go on a podcast that was all about camping in the best tents, I would be like, no, that's okay. I'll get my air mattress. We call it glamping. Actually, I'll just sleep in my bed. So I think it's important too that just because you get an opportunity doesn't mean that you have to take it. Have you seen where people maybe do that and then they're just kind of dead in the water, super awkward because they just jumped at an opportunity that didn't really fit?
Yeah, sometimes, but I also consider those to be really good learning experiences, right? Because then you learn oh, well, that's not my type of show to be on, right? Or, oh, I really do need to do more research before I say yes to these things, so I don't commit to something that isn't really going to be a good fit for me, right? So it can definitely happen, but I think, you want to pay attention to when those kinds of things happen in life and business to figure out, okay, what can I learn from that experience so I don't repeat that mistake over and over again.
That's good. I like how you're taking everything. It's all learning. I can totally see that about you. It's always a learning. Do it poorly, but then do it better. I love that attitude. So with podcasting in particular, do you ever recommend that people podcast and interview multiple people? That was a big question. Is it easier for one, or is having multiple people fun or exciting? Or is that no, just don't do it?
So you mean multiple people at the same episode or in different episodes?
The same time, literally at the same time, not even different segments, all at the same time.
I don't like the multi-person discussions for podcasts, probably partly because I'm an introvert. So I love like the one-on-one connection with people, you know? Um, but I just find that, you know, a three-way conversation or a four-way conversation can just be a lot harder to follow from a listener's perspective, especially if you don't have, you know, the visual cues to go by as well. So personally, I love the one-on-one interview format. That's my favorite by far, but it doesn't mean you can't do other formats. It's just my personal favorite.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned visual cues because that's why I love Zoom, because then I can actually see you. I feel like I'm talking to you rather than like that awkwardness. You can tell if I'm stopping on what I'm saying or if I'm about to talk because my body language. Whereas if you're on the phone exclusively or something like that, then it's so much harder and you end up with a lot more interruption. Certainly if you've got multiple podcasts going on at one time. So Ray, who asked that question, absolutely, you probably don't want to have a bunch of people on at once if you're not on some type of visual recognition, which is smart. Now, for podcasting, you have talked about having people on the show. Is there anything that people can do that can naturally bring up their book or their, what they're doing in a natural way? Or is it the responsibility of the podcaster to ask them about that and they should just wait until that happens?
Yeah, so, you know, my philosophy in this is probably kind of unique and not the norm, but my philosophy is like, I don't even care if they mention, you know, my book or my product or whatever, because that's not my purpose. And not that I don't want to sell books or I don't want to, you know, promote my publishing company. It's just that, like, I feel like when I go into an interview with that agenda, it makes it less fun for me, honestly, right? Like if I feel like I have to get this thing in there, then I feel like I have these expectations and I can't really be present in the conversation as much. So in my experience, anytime you're on a podcast that has some level of success, whether that's 1 million downloads or they've done 500 episodes, like they've got some real experience there, they're going to try to find a way to promote you or your work, especially if you ask them, especially if they know like that's why you're doing it. So if you're doing, you know, 12 interviews because you're just releasing a new book, they're going to know that from your correspondence. And so they're going to try to, if they're professionals, they're going to try to promote your book either at the beginning of the interview by introducing you and talking about your book or asking you questions about the book, or at the end of the interview, because oftentimes at the end of the interview, the host will say, you know, tell us more about what people can find out about you or what you're working on right now. And that's kind of your opportunity to, in 60 seconds or less, talk about your book or your product or what you're working on that you're really excited about that you want to share with people.
Yeah, that's good. And I find that most of the time people will specifically ask that at the end. So if you try to push it again and again in the beginning, it's a little awkward. So I think that's good. Now, when people are promoting their podcasts, like let's say I was on an interview and I wanted to tell everyone about it, what are some of the best ways to tell people and share that? Because it's part of why you go on an interview. It's not just to have it and say, hey, I did it, but to put it out there. So what are some of the best ways for that?
So it kind of depends what your overall business looks like, right? So I definitely recommend you have like an author website, for example, and you can have a press page on your website. And so you can have either the press page or even just like an interviews page where you have, you know, the YouTube videos or the podcast links or the press mentions for yourself or your books or your interviews. So that's a great way to do it. You can also write blog posts about it. Or link to those podcasts in your blog post. That really helps build up the search rankings for those podcasts as well, so more people are likely to find them. Sharing it on social media is a great way to do it. If you have an email list, which you definitely should, emailing your list and saying, hey, here's an interview I just did. But those are kind of the main ways that I found that worked really, really well. But just make sure, it kind of depends like how many interviews you do. Like if you only have one interview, then probably you want to do all those things. But if you're doing 50 interviews for your new book release, you don't need to post all 50 on social media. You know, it's just not necessary. And people are probably going to kind of bored by the 50th one, right? So I recommend if you're doing a bunch of interviews, pick the top ones that you think are the most important or the most unique and really promote those ones extra. But really at the end of the day, you know, we do want to share the interviews that we've done, but also realize that it's really the podcast host's kind of main, it's mostly their responsibility to promote their show, right? So we definitely want to support them in that, but you don't have to feel like you're obligated to email your list every time you go on an interview, because that's just not the way it is, in my opinion.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I think that's even more true. It's different if you were asking to be on someone's show. I think there is some expectation that if I ask to be on your show, that I will do a little bit more marketing or outreach on my end. But if you are invited to be a guest, then definitely it falls in the podcaster's court. Now, on the other side of that, let's say someone does an interview and it was awful. It was awful, but it still went live. Can they do anything about it? Should they do anything about it? Should they just say, hey, I learned, and sweep it under the rug?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, just there's a lot of things in life that aren't going to be the way you expected or the way you want it to be. And I think you kind of have to learn to live with that, right? It's just like a bad review for your book on Amazon, right? You kind of have to learn to live with that. So I think it'd be kind of rude to ask someone to, after they've done all the work of editing it and promoting it and publishing it, ask them to remove it. Unless there's you said something that legally you shouldn't have said, or, something like that is like a real important reason. But if it's just because you just don't like it, or you think you look bad, or the lighting's not good in your face, I think just let it go and try to move on and focus on what you can do today to take your career to the next level, instead of being focused on the past and trying to fix things that you can't fix anymore.
Yeah, that's really good, because I know we work with authors all the time who, even with, you mentioned an Amazon review, someone gets a bad review and they're like, oh my God, how do I get it taken down? And I'm just like, no, it's just there, and that's okay. And sometimes it's okay to have those blips, because in some ways it can add more interest and it can make you more of a real person anyway. So I think that's
I always tell people about reviews, Harry Potter has hundreds of one-star reviews, right? So I would be honored to have my books have that many one-star reviews, because it means there's going to be a lot more positive ones, right? And there's going to be a lot more people buying and reading that book. So, it's a mistake to think that someone who's successful has no bad reviews or no failures or no mistakes. They actually have way more than people who aren't successful, because that's how they got there in the first place. So I actually recommend celebrating those things. Oh, I got my first one-star review. Yeah, high five, let's go. Because that's a sign of success, right? It's part of your journey. We all have to go through that journey. So, again, celebrating those mistakes, figuring out what you can learn from them. Bad reviews. I always read the reviews to figure out, is there something I can learn from that? Is it just, is it a character attack? Then I can just ignore that part of it. But maybe there's one line there that says, hey, there's something I could do to make that book better, and I can either go back and edit the book now or learn for next time to not make that same mistake again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as far as celebrating, I literally just had an author get a crushing one-star review, and I said, congratulations, you're a real author now. Because that's really true, is that if you haven't gotten that, then probably most of the people giving you reviews are, maybe they really like you in real person, but when you get that first review, I mean, it's something that's okay. And I personally, go and read bad reviews. If I'm looking for a book or a product, I read the bad reviews to see if the things that they didn't like would even bother me. So it's not that it doesn't keep me from buying something, it just lets me know more about the product. So just because you have a bad review doesn't mean you've got to hide it. Same thing with podcasting, I think. And you did mention lighting and things like that. Do you find it best if people sit in front of a camera and kind of practice or prep themselves first, or does that make them too stiff?
I mean, I think you should practice in front of a camera, but you shouldn't practice what you're going to say on the show. I don't think so much. And I think the exception to that would be let's say someone's going to ask you to promote your book, or where people find out more information about you, things like that. And you might want to practice those 30-second or 10-second things that you want to say, just so you're really clear about what you want to say. And I write out the script sometimes too, in a Word doc, just so I know what I'm going to say, because it's you're going to see the same thing over and over again. And eventually it just becomes a habit, right? So I would prepare for those things that I'm definitely going to have to talk about this thing every time. Then maybe prepare for those 30 or 60 seconds. But I think the main benefit of preparing is not so that, because an interview is not like a presentation. A podcast is not like a presentation. It's more like a discussion, right? But the benefit of preparation in general is just that you get more comfortable being on Zoom, being on a camera, speaking into a microphone, that kind of stuff. So I think preparation is important for just being more comfortable. but not to, make sure that your presentation is perfect, because it's never going to be perfect.
Yeah, and I always tell my authors, get on Zoom first. Do not let this be your first Zoom experience. That's never going to be comfortable. So I can't tell you how many times I practice with clients, and the first time they get on camera, like their camera is right here, and I'm like, I see your nose. Can we back it up just a little bit? Or nope, that you must be on mute if you can't hear me. So get comfortable with whatever format. If you know you're being interviewed on Zoom or Be Live or something different, make sure that you're comfortable using that software ahead of time. And if you don't have access to the software, maybe just tell the podcaster, I've never been on this before. Would it be okay if we got on, 3 minutes early so I could get comfortable with it? Because that's going to make their interview better as well. So generally, most of them will be very understanding if you're like, hey, I've used Zoom a million times, but I have no clue about this other format that you're using, or using Skype, whatever it may be. And so to kind of tack on to that, as far as, I love that you don't want to prep, but you want to have an idea of what you say about your book. I think it's really important that if anyone asks you about your book, you have a very short emphasis on the very short explanation of your book, where people can get it, where they can read more about you. I should be able to, if anyone stops me on the street and says, hey, what do you do and how can I learn more about it? I should have a very short explanation. And I think something that a lot of authors make the mistake of is they constantly reference my book instead of using the title. So use your title when you can. That way people can go and search it. I know I am infamous for this, where I'm like, I heard this really great interview, don't remember the guy's name, don't remember anything about him, but I remember the title of the book, or the show that they had. So when you can give specifics, I think it's probably helpful rather than being general, because if you just say things like my book or my website without giving the specifics, you could be anyone, right? Now, when you are doing podcasting, is there any magical length that people should be shooting for? Is there a podcast length that does really well, and then one that just loses interest really fast?
I'm not sure what you mean by link. You mean like iTunes or Stitcher, or like which platform do you want to share?
No, sorry, I wasn't clear. The length of the podcast. Like, should they be aiming for 15 minutes, an hour? Sorry, I wasn't speaking clearly.
I thought you said link. You said length. Okay. How long should a podcast be? There's debates. There's everything from the 60-second quote of the day to get your day kickstarted in the morning on the right foot, to the 3-4 hour long marathon interviews. So personally, for me, I like the 30 to 60 minute kind of interview format, because I feel like it's long enough to talk about a real depth of the subject and to really get to know the person and the subject matter in a lot more detail. But personally, after like an hour or so, I'm fading. I'm kind of like, I want to go on the next thing, So that's my favorite kind of length for interviews, to both to be the interviewer as well as the interviewee. But there is no wrong way, and there are highly successful podcasters doing everything from 60 seconds to several hour long podcast episodes. So I would say experiment with different things, see what you like, see what your audience likes, and just go with what's best based on your personal opinion and your audience's opinion too.
And do you think it's okay for a podcast to have different lengths? So is it okay if one time it's 15 minutes and the next time it's an hour? Or do you think it's important to keep everything really consistent?
Yeah, it's definitely okay to have lots of different formats. So like if you look at a lot of the top shows, they'll have maybe their interviews, which are X amount of minutes, like 45 minutes, let's say, for example. And then they might have their, weekly action tips that might be 5 or 10 minutes. And they might have like different kinds of episodes for their show. And those different episodes would have different time formats or time ranges. So it's absolutely fine to do different formats. There's never been once where I was listening to a podcast and I thought, oh my gosh, that first interview was 20 minutes and the second one was 2 hours, and I can't believe, I'm so upset, right? It just never happened to me. Like either I liked it or I didn't like it, but like it wasn't about how long it was. It was about, did I like the content or not?
Got it. So don't sweat the details too much. Now, on kind of that same vein, but not as much, is consistency key? Is posting, do you find that you develop a following faster when they know when to expect your podcast? Or is it okay to just be like, hey, I'm going to get one out when I get it out? Or should I be going, I'm going to do a weekly podcast, or it's a podcast that comes out every other Tuesday? Does that matter?
Yeah, so I think for podcasting, consistency is really important. Now, it's not important for everything, but across the board, whether you're blogging or doing podcasts or doing social media, the more consistent you are, all else being equal, the more successful you're going to be, right? And especially for a podcast, the reason why it's so important is because someone is going to commute to work 5 days a week and they need something to listen to, right? And so if they get to the point where they listen to all of your episodes, and now they're waiting for your next one, and they expect it to be on Monday because all your past ones are on Monday, and now it's not, that's going to create a disconnect and an upset for them. They're going to have to find something else to replace your show with, right? And they might not come back because they're just, we forget things, or we get busy, or we don't know when you're going to release a new episode. So I do recommend you stay consistent with your schedule if you can. So commit to doing once a week or twice a week or whatever it is, because that's going to, and communicate that to your audience so that they understand what that's going to be like. So if you do that, I think you'll get a better relationship with your audience, and you'll get more consistent listeners, and you'll get a more loyal audience. Doesn't mean you have to do it that way, but if your goal is, I want the maximum number of downloads and listeners who are loyal, that's the way to do it for sure, is to be as consistent and to publish as many new episodes as possible.
Awesome. And now I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Do you have any favorite podcasts that you listen to or recommend?
Ooh, good question. So I don't listen to too many podcasts right now. I'm really much more into YouTube, because I just find like a lot of the lectures and stuff on YouTube, like I really like the searchability of YouTube a lot more personally when I'm looking to learn something. But Planet Money is really good. There's a lot of NPR podcasts that are really good, like Hidden Brain. Tim Ferriss, sometimes I really don't like him, but sometimes there's just some great guests on there that I learn a ton from. So I've got several that I'm subscribed to, but there's not a single podcast where I listen to every episode or where I like every episode. So for me, I'm a little bit more eclectic. I just subscribe to a bunch of different things, and then when I'm kind of in the mood, I go through and look for that catchy title or the catchy person I really want to learn from.
Love it. And I think that if you want to be a guest on podcasts, you should probably listen to podcasts. Not saying that you have to, like, it doesn't have to be your favorite thing, but if you were trying to be a guest on podcasts, you should be listening. You should be finding the ones that you like, don't like, because I think that if you get a spot, or if you pitch someone that you really enjoyed listening to, you'll probably jive a little bit better, which is important. I mean, it's so important that when you're talking to the other person on the phone or the camera, that you've got some type of chemistry there. We can talk back and forth and it's not super awkward. So I think that's really important. So thank you, Tom. I know you've given us so much information today, but I'd love to know, I know you're not podcasting as much right now. What are you working on?
Yeah, so we're working on a lot of things right now. So we do daily blog posts. So every week we research 7 in-depth posts to share what's going on in the publishing industry and what authors can do to learn more about how to write better, how to sell more books, how to do better marketing, and how to use technology to solve their problems, whether they're starting a podcast or starting a blog or things like that. So that's a big thing we're always working on. And the other thing we're working on now is a whole new online course platform. So our current technology is like 10 years old, and it was state of the art back then, but now there's much better things out there. So we're in transitioning this week to a whole new course platform, which can provide a much better way for our students to learn online with way more interactive stuff. And so we're really excited about that right now.
Great. And you mentioned a course. What is your course and how can people find out more about it?
Yeah, so we have 6 online courses, tckpublishing.com. If you go to the website and click the shop page, there's a course tab there. So our best one for authors, or the most popular one for authors, is the complete Kindle publishing course, and where we teach you everything step by step to go from just an idea for a book to writing the book and actually publishing it on Amazon for people who want to self-publish. So that's a great opportunity for folks to learn.
That's awesome. And I know that is, I mean, as much as 10 years ago, working on Amazon and through CreateSpace at the time was kind of like looked down upon, but more and more we're seeing that even mid-sized publishers are going through KDP for some aspects of their publishing. And considering that, I mean, over 90% of ebooks are sold directly on Kindle and Amazon, and about 50% of print books are sold on Amazon. Like they're in the game. And if you don't pay attention to them, you're going to lose out, right?
Absolutely. And the other thing about Amazon is that like they don't really provide clear instructions on how to do things, right? So if you don't put your keywords in correctly, if you don't put your metadata in correctly, if you don't list your categories correctly, all these things can really impact positively or negatively your sales on the platform, right? And so that's why I think the course is so important, and also our blog is so important, to just teach people like all the little things you have to do to optimize your chances for success, right? And the other thing, really important thing for folks to understand about Amazon is that it's all based on data science. So their whole algorithm is trying to figure out who's buying this type of book and who else would like to buy this type of book. And so they're looking at every purchase every customer has ever made, right? So if someone's bought 10 romance novels and you just published a romance novel, they might recommend your book to those readers, right? But if they do that and those readers don't like to buy your book, it's kind of like the Amazon kiss of death, right? Because they're going to find another book to promote to those readers that's going to sell more to make them more money, more profit, right? And so that's a big thing I focus on and teach as well, is how do you actually maximize your conversion rates on Amazon? Because if one book sells, let's say 10% of people who look at the book buy it on Amazon, another book, 12% of people who click on it buy it, Amazon is going to promote that book that's converting at 12% all day, every single day, right? And so things like getting more reviews, things like having really great book titles, really catchy subtitles, great book cover designs, great book descriptions, being in the right categories, having the right keywords, all these things to make an incremental improvement in that conversion rate. And when you combine those things, that's when you really give your book the biggest chance for success on Amazon, which, like you said, is where the vast majority of the money is going to come from, whether you're self-published or officially published, because they're selling most of the ebooks, like you said, and like half of the print books too. And of course, 90% some of the audiobooks as well for Audible.
I like how you threw that in there. Audiobooks are definitely, I mean, they've been up and coming. They keep rising because people like to listen and do. We like to multitask now, I think. So, and I love what you're saying too about how Amazon is collecting data on everyone, because Amazon is actually the second largest search engine right after Google. So they have massive amounts of information and they're absolutely using it. They want happy customers who keep purchasing from them, who keep buying, because who hasn't done that when they're like, well, this people who had your items in their cart also bought, and then you're like, oh, I didn't need that, but I'm going to go ahead and buy it. Or maybe I'm just telling on myself, but I feel like other people probably do it too. And so I know you've used this for your own books, Tom. I know the answer, but they don't. How many books have you gotten to #1 bestsellers? What kind of success have you personally seen on Amazon?
So I've lost track. So we published over 400 books, and I definitely know for sure over 100 have become #1 bestsellers. But I mean, the past 5 years, every book we published that I can recall has become #1 bestseller on Amazon. And part of that is because it's just so easy. Like it's not really that complicated once you understand some marketing and if you have an audience, right? So there's a couple things that make that happen. So first of all, we have an email list of readers. So we have over 10,000 people on our email list who are just readers who want to read our books. And so every time we publish a new book, we email that list. And so we can get dozens or hundreds of sales just from our own audience every time we publish a book. And the other thing is that Amazon has over 47,000 bestseller lists for ebooks and print books. And that's just on Amazon.com. Amazon UK has more, Amazon Germany has more, and so on. So there are so many categories to choose from. And so we actually years ago, we created a software called Bestseller Ranking Pro. And I created it just in-house for us to have so we could track every bestseller list on Amazon and try to figure out which ones are more competitive and which ones are less competitive. Because the way Amazon categories work is if your book is ranked number 101 on a category in Amazon, you get no benefit from that whatsoever in terms of new customers, new eyeballs. But if you're ranked number 100 or number 1, you're going to get a lot of people who are browsing those category pages who are going to see your book basically being promoted for free by Amazon. So our strategy for many years now has been to find the relevant categories for our books where we can rank in the top 100 based on kind of how many sales we know we can sell during the launch. So all of our books become bestsellers, and many of them become #1 bestsellers as well, because with 47,000 lists, there's a bunch of lists where you can sell 1 book or 5 books or 10 books and become a #1 bestseller. So that's not the hard part. The hard part is how do you find the relevant bestseller lists, and how do you continue to market that book so it's not just a bestseller for 1 day or 1 week, but will sell for month after month after month.
Yeah. Well, I want to be like you when I grow up and say, oh, I lost count of my #1 bestsellers. I just can't keep track. But I think something really important that you said was that they were relevant categories. So you're not suggesting that I just find the least competitive category and I'm like, yeah, my romance book could be about liability insurance. No problem.
Yeah, definitely. Like it doesn't actually help. It actually is counterproductive to do that. And here's why. So remember we talked about the data science? So in a conversion rate. So if you put your book in all these all these categories that are not relevant, right? And if you ask all your friends and family to buy your book, and if you get on podcasts that aren't relevant, and you promote your book to all these different audiences that aren't interested in, let's say, romance novels that you're publishing, then what happens is Amazon says, hey, look, we've got 25 people who bought, 5 love languages. And so let's promote this romance novel and to those readers, right? And no one's going to buy that book because Amazon thinks that your target customer is someone other than who they really are. And so the conversion rate goes to 0. And that really is the Amazon kiss of death, where Amazon says, hey, look, you have these customers. We looked at the data. We tried to promote your book to those customers who like the ones that you sent us because you sent those sales to us, right? And they're not buying. And that is a big, big, big mistake. So that's why we don't recommend picking irrelevant categories. And that's why I recommend when you initially launch your book, you want to aim for 200, 250 sales that are as targeted as possible. And so that's why I think like the book promotion services like BookBub and Bargain Booksy can be so valuable, because they actually target those email lists based on their reader interests, right? And some book promotion sites don't do that. And that's why there's other ones that I don't recommend, because they can just send you random readers and they're not necessarily the ones that are targeted, and they're not going to help you as much on Amazon.
So you don't want to play the game unfairly. You don't want to put yourself in bad categories because you're cheating yourself later on. I mean, and honestly, if you have a book and you make #1 in a category that has nothing to do with your book, are you really going to tell everyone that? Like, am I really going to be like, hey, guess what? I was #1 in. No, because people are going to look at me with the side eye going, oh, okay. So I think that it's important, like you said, to stay true to your book category, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because it actually does help you further on. And it's not worth trying to cheat, essentially, to get into a bestseller list that really will hurt you later on down the road, which I think is so valuable. It's not just hitting a #1 bestseller or bestseller list. It's about hitting the right bestseller list so that you can springboard off of that for your future sales and your, future readers and promotions. So important. All right, Tom, well, we have taken up so much of your time today, and I appreciate it so much. You are a wealth of knowledge. I think it's crazy that you have been successful in so many different parts of the promotion in the publishing industry. So just one more time, everyone can find you at tckpublishing.com.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
Well, again, thank you so much. Our New Shelves and Free Advice Fridays listeners are going to find so much value out of this. So we appreciate you, and thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Keri. Have a great day, everyone. Take care.